Welcome back to Niño Speaks. Today, I have on independent precious metal advisor, Claudio Grass. It's been a while since you've been on the show, Claudio, and it's grown since then. So there's likely a lot of new listeners who aren't aware of your body of work. Before we start, just briefly tell them about yourself.
Well, I'm a freedom-loving individual from Switzerland. And basically, I think some 25 years ago, I realized, that the world is a bit more complex than what I thought. And I did not really grasp what's going on. So when, 9/11 and the dot-com bubble and Enron, MCI, when we had this. And then basically I decided, I have to do my own research. And unfortunately, I started with monetary history. I was reading Ferdinand Lips, he was the gold pope over here in Switzerland. So he basically had a book about explaining, how money came into existence and the whole monetary history for the last few thousand years. And that basically then brought me also to the Austrian School of Economics. So, trying to grasp how an economy can work, trying to grasp how society should be organized and so on, philosophy. I mean, that basically led me all to the Mises crowd. And then I started as a reaction, because I started with monetary history, I started to buy physical gold in 2004. And then I was able in 2011 to move into the precious metal business. I helped to build up a company over here in Switzerland, which basically has been made for a harsh crisis scenario, from customers from all over the world who understand that gold is money, who understand that gold is their insurance, who understand that gold is their pension. And so for them, it was really important to find a solution how to store physical gold in the format they purchased, especially, keeping and storing it outside the traditional banking system. Because, my customers and I myself, we all expect that in the future, we're going to see, the biggest risks are in the banking system. So therefore, it's important to, detect or, to separate the individual and also the assets, and have something outside of the banking system to make sure that the private property rights are respected in the best possible way. And so so basically that's brought me to gold and also the services that I provide. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So what I understood is, of course, that government is the biggest threat and that the whole political Muppet show is a competition of crooks. And therefore, this is also, the way I look at the world. I'm also following, what's going on in Switzerland. How is the government reacting? And fortunately, for the time being, I have to say, okay, all countries have changed. All countries are moving in the wrong direction. But still, because of the structure over here in Switzerland, let's say when it comes to private property rights, the gold confiscation is impossible in Switzerland, especially when it's kept outside the banking system. Because if our government wants to do something like this, our politicians don't have the power to come up with those kind of decisions, like in the US or in the Eurozone and so on. So here in Switzerland, they would really have to bring it in front of the people, which is always a process that lasts, at least 6 to 12 months. So that also gives us always, also time to respond if we would see that, Switzerland could go also in the wrong direction. And therefore, I'm working with partners who basically are clearly operating under Swiss law, but at the same time are offering a structure which will also allow us, to move metals in a very short period of time to different continents if we would need to do so. Because right now, of course, Europe is in the center. I think the United States is in the center too. But Europe is basically in the sandwich position between NATO and the Russians. And I hope that Switzerland, the people in Switzerland, they always want to remain independent, neutral, sovereign. But what we have witnessed over the last 4 or 5 years is basically these politicians, they just do whatever they want to do, and basically not following the constitution any longer. And that's, of course, something we really have to observe on a very sensitive level, be alert if we see something could go wrong.
You mentioned gold as a store of value, and when you read like history books or just even contemporary commentary on gold, many people cite that as a reason as to why they acquire it. What makes gold a valuable possession and as a like a store of value in times of like major economic uncertainties?
I mean, at the end of the day, everything on this planet has a certain purpose. And I think the only purpose when it comes to gold is basically, it's money. And it's something that all the women still love. They love to hang around golden chains around their neck and so on. So it always has been considered as precious. It's scarce. Central banks cannot print it. It's easy recognizable. It's easy divisible. At the end of the day, it was also easy to transport because if you think about 1 ounce of gold, which is today, we have new highs in the gold price. Today, an ounce of gold is $2,808 at the moment. Wow. So you can basically transport, 31 grams of gold, which has a value of 2,800 right now. So it's, that's that basically. Yeah. And then we have, of course, when it comes to history, I always talk about, the history books. I mean, paper takes a lot on the pages, and we don't know what is true and what is not, what might be also a lie. But when it comes to gold coins, for example, I mean, we can witness, we can see that for thousands of years, you find gold coins. So it has been money, because really, I mean, market participants all over the world already in the past, they realized or they decided for themselves that the most liquid asset, which is a store of value, which must be scarce, and also people have to love it, that this basically made gold and silver, of course, the dominant currency on a global scale. And when you look at the world today, I mean, since October last year, basically gold has overtook the number 2 rank within the reserve currencies. So gold is now bigger than the euro, and the biggest currency or currency reserve still is the US dollar. But it basically just shows, gold is gaining momentum, and gold is getting back as to become money again.
That $2,800 mark is quite remarkable for gold. What factors explain it reaching such a price in recent days?
I mean, gold always goes up when people feel insecure, when the future is not bright, when the future is unsecure. When people lose trust into the institutions, when people lose trust into their fiat money, for example, when we have geopolitical risks which are rising, that's basic. These are all drivers for gold, of course. And at the same time, it's also inflation. Once people realize, that what inflation is. I mean, in the past, we have seen inflation, asset price inflation. Huge amounts of credit has been kicked into the system and basically, pushed into real estate and stock markets and so on. And there we have seen a huge inflation, for example. But now, of course, over the last few years, I think, it's reasonable to say that the majority has lost, 30% of its purchasing power over the last 3-4 years. So now people realize, normal stuff is going up, groceries are going up, insurances are going up, and all that kind of stuff. So people basically can see, that their paper money is becoming worth less and less.
I see. And you said you're based out of Switzerland, and Switzerland has always intrigued me because despite the universal trend of most Western states embracing large administrative states that work against their native populations, civil liberties, and their general interests, in addition to embracing political correctness and mass migration, Switzerland seems to have not have gone in such a radical direction. Yeah, it's not like the same like it was, like say, like a century ago, but it's gone at a slower pace. What do you think contributes to the fact that Switzerland has remained a relatively sane polity by Western standards?
I think it has a lot to do with the culture and the political system, of course, within Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland has been always, the historical idea of Switzerland is pure subsidiarity, decentralization, non-centralization, let's call it that way. It's even better. So, everything was built up from the bottom up. The municipality is the most important. And then if the municipality has a problem, it can call the state to help them if necessary in a crisis scenario and so on. But basically everything was built from the bottom up and never from the top down. And of course, at the same time, that is reflected in our government, because when you look at our president, we don't have one president, we have 7 presidents. And there we also have this division of power into different people. And then we also had, the direct democracy. So people were always able to vote. We were able to hand in initiatives, gathering 100,000 signatory, for the people, and then we could bring it in front of the politicians, and basically also have a public vote over here in Switzerland. So it was a kind of exchange between the people and the politicians. And this is still the DNA of Switzerland. When you look at the constitution of Switzerland, it was always about the protection of private property. And it was about the protection of the individual, that he really owns, so that the understanding was given in Switzerland that we are all born free. And even when we look back into the history, from the 12th century, basically, the Swiss were, fighting all the foreign dukes and kings who wanted to enslave them. So, we were Swiss farmers living up in the mountain area. Whenever we had some armies coming in trying to oppress the Swiss, then we basically for 200 years defeated all these guys. So, these crazy farmers from the mountain area were fighting all those knights, in their special uniform and all that stuff. So I think so that also, led to the situation that we became then the best paid mercenaries and so on. And also because of the strategic location within Switzerland, being the fastest north-south transit route through these Alp regions gave us strategically also a good position, so that basically all the surrounding dukes and kings and rulers decided to leave Switzerland alone. So that we became basically, our own republic with a very bottom-up approach.
From my reading of Swiss history, even into the 19th century, it wasn't one of the first countries to really industrialize and modernize. But when and how did it become such a prominent location for banking and as a spot where people could have a unprecedented degree of banking privacy and asset protection?
Switzerland, but based on the history that I have, it has been considered, during the 19th century that Switzerland was pretty poor, because we never had gold, we never had oil, no strategic assets, no metals in the ground and so on. Just, high mountains, hard winters, hot summers. So it was not easy to make a living here in Switzerland. However, with the Industrial Revolution, basically Switzerland became the highest industrialized nation after the Brits on the continent of Europe, even before the Germans. And that's basically started with all the Protestant cantons that we had. We had Protestant cantons, Catholics, and so on. And so the Catholics were basically saying, no, for us it's more important to have a close relationship with God. So we remain, we pray and we work and we try to have a decent life. And of course, the Protestants, they were a bit more ambitious. And they started all the textile industries, So we had all the farmhouses, basically all these farmer girls, they started to spin, cotton, that kind of stuff. But so that was the industrialization which really took place, and then also led to quite success when it comes to Switzerland. Because we had mercenaries all over the world, we also had a great network. You were able to find Swiss people in India and the United States, everywhere on this planet. And also when the Huguenots, during the prosecution, when the Protestants were basically prosecuted, a lot of these guys, successful ones, they also came to Switzerland. They also brought, their money along. The Huguenots, for example, they started the watchmaker manufacturing, or we had, the Protestants from Germany, they started the machine industry. And so we just, we became, Switzerland had a great reputation, hardworking people, a handshake is a handshake, we deliver on time. We have, since the Westphalian peace, we have been given, neutrality, armed neutrality, respected by all the dominant powers on the continent. And then, this political stability also then gave us, we became a banking place, but we have never been a huge banking place, during or before the Second World War. It was still, we had the banking secrecy, which basically people realized that it's important that we protect the individual against an overwhelming state. That's why we implemented the banking secrecy, to protect the individual against the state, because it's none of the business of the government to know, every single, how much everyone owns and so on. And so I think, then with the Second World War, Switzerland was the only country operating on the gold standard. All the rest of the world basically abolished the gold standard. But, we were also forced, to stay on the gold standard, because the Allies, as well as the Germans and so on, they wanted to trade in Swiss francs, and then, of course, redeem the Swiss francs into physical gold. Even neutral nations. That's, war is a dirty business. Switzerland just had, we never made money during the Second World War by basically operating on the gold standard. So we had less gold after the Second World War than we had before the Second World War. So we never, we did not, because a lot of people believe that we became wealthy because of the Second World War, and this is basically not true. I also have a lot of doubts when it comes to, all this, we had this in the year 2000, when you had the NATO and all these guys going after the Swiss, saying that that we were hiding still, Jewish money and so on. I think that has been completely an overkill. Because even, for Jews back then during the Second World War, Switzerland was just a very small entity, with a few million people, heavily armed. But, it was not, it didn't make, it did not, if someone wanted to have their gold, their money in a safe jurisdiction during the Second World War, people did not bring it to Switzerland. They brought it to the UK, they brought it to the States, mainly because it also made more sense. And so, but since 24 years, basically, I can see from the inside, but also from the outside, that a lot of people are trying to destroy Switzerland by saying that we are the belly of the beast, that we made the money, and, from war and so on, that we have all these international institutions in Switzerland because we are the bad guys, the WHO, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and so on. And I also digged into the Swiss history. But, I think the banking place just came along because we really have been stable. Of course, the banking secrecy was also helping, privacy, protecting the individual. But, that's that kind of banking, it's gone for a very long time. And today, even if you look at Switzerland, I think 10% of the GDP and so on is in the banking sector. So we are not a dominated financial hub any longer as in the past.
With respect to gold, is the gold standard constitutionally protected in Switzerland, or is it just taken for granted as a part of its broader economic and political culture?
Switzerland was the last nation remaining on a gold standard until the year of 2000. And then we also, in the year 2000, we also had the politicians were basically saying we have to modernize the constitution. Nothing special is going to happen, so they basically pushed this public poll through in a very short period of time, not telling the people that under the modernization that they also are taking out the gold backing within the constitution, because we always had, the central banks was required to keep 40% of their money in circulation backed by physical gold. And this has been taken out in 2000. So, we had an asset, the Swiss National Bank had a balance of, let's say, 50 billion up to 2006. And then we went up to 1,000 billion, within a decade. And now we are, I don't know, maybe back to 800 billion and so on. So, when the Swiss left, the gold standard, that now we have seen, that the central banks just basically was able to print as much money as they want. It's a ridiculous amount. But so just to come back to so we still have 1,050 tons of gold. I think that's still left. But, you know, when you sign to become a member of the International Monetary Fund, you also have to sign that gold is not a monetary asset. But I mean, we're still sitting on the gold. And I think that gold is also still in Switzerland. I think that we sold, 50% of the gold reserves in 2004. And I think that gold has been stored in the UK and in the United States and New York. But I think the one we have right now, it's still there. And the good stuff, of course, is also that on average, each Swiss owns roughly 250 grams of gold, which is really high on a capital basis. So that just shows that, okay, the central bank still has a big, as we're number 4 or number 5 worldwide in terms of gold reserves when it comes to the national banks. But at the same time, it also shows that the Swiss still have a connection to gold because people own gold. And of course, we still have the 4 most important refineries over here in Switzerland. We used to 70% of the gold refining worldwide. Now we are down to 40% because of rules and regulations and all these, you know, bureaucrats and left-wing people, the guys who don't understand how an economy is working. But so we lost a bit when it comes to the gold refining on a global scale, but at the same time, we are still a gold hub when we look at the average inhabitant of Switzerland.
What prompted the Swiss political class to basically do away with this tradition of having a gold standard? Was it just part of like an overarching political trend in the West, or were there specific factors kind of like unique to Switzerland that pushed them over the edge to do away with that?
Gold is the antidote, you know, and so central banks and the banking system, they hate gold. Because what they want to create money out of thin air, you know, and charge interest on it and give it to whoever they want to and for what the rates, and use that money to bribe politicians and to fight wars and so on. I mean, even gold, you know, the First World War, I think, would have been over if they would have paid with gold. I think the First World would have been over in 3 or 4 weeks. And so I think also over here in 2000, I mean, you know, it was, you know, when the Brits were selling their gold reserves, you know, a lot of central banks were selling their gold. They even announced that they're going to sell gold in the coming days, so even putting down the price. So some people back then were saying that all these bullion banks in the past, you know, they were basically leaning gold physically from the central banks. Then they sold the gold, used the money, you know, and went into bonds and earned, you know, 6, 7, 8%. And so as that business was pretty good as long as the gold price was going down. And then basically in 2000, you have seen, you know, that there was the beginning of the last bull market in gold when it went from $180 or $200 an ounce to 1900 from 2000 to 2011. So some people were also saying that all the central banks had to sell their gold because otherwise, you know, the big bullion banks would have gone down because they didn't have, you know, the gold to repay. So basically that's why the central banks had to push down the price and also flood the market with gold so that the bullion banks were able to recover their positions. And at the same time, of course, you know, look at if there, you know, gold has been the last anchor for central banking policy, you know. So, and of course, when the Swiss basically canceled that anchor, then the central bank was able to print as much money as they wanted. So there was no limit any longer. And I think we have seen that all over the world for a very long time. And I mean, even when I think at all these trillions which have been injected into the financial system since 2008, I don't know, 120, 150 trillion. And I always say, you know, 1 trillion seconds represents 31,709 years. So it's a huge figure. It's a huge figure. So it's completely nonsense, you know. But then, of course, we end up with NVIDIAs who basically have a performance of 300,000%, you know, and really went exponential in 2020 and 2022. Just, it's all fake. I mean, it's really absurd, you know, when you look at the stock markets, these top 7 stocks, the digital stocks, NVIDIA can lose, 600 billion overnight. And UBS is worth 100 billion, and they are worth 3,600 billion. I mean, it's a Muppet show. I mean, I cannot take it serious any longer, but, you know, as long as the music is on, and then, you know, people are dancing, but I am expecting, a correction this year. I mean, for sure.
What is noticeable about when countries go off like a gold standard and go towards like a conventional fiat money system, that it's accompanied or at least followed by an unprecedented expansion in like the administrative state, and you see a host of other civil and economic liberties diminish in time. Did that also happen with Switzerland when it went off the gold standard in 2000?
For example, in Europe, I mean, what we have witnessed over the last 24 years was also a kind of mass migration agenda, for example. So, we had a lot of foreigners coming in from very poor countries, most of the time also from countries who have been bombed by the West, for decades. And so different cultures, some of these guys were living, really up in the mountain area in a different culture. And so I think because we had a lot of mass migration, I mean, also the whole situation, the security situation became a bit more difficult over here. And we both know, the war is the health of the state. So to me, I think we have seen that the government is becoming more aggressive and it's going more against the individual. We have also realized that the government, the police is not there to protect the individual. The police is basically there to protect the institution, the state. And I think that has been done because of, a lot of these. I mean, in Switzerland, we have every day, we also have in the big cities, we have a guy stabbed with a knife, another one is shot, a third one is whatever. I mean, it's crazy. And I think this has led, to, it's more barbaric these days. The government, when you put pressure on the police, then they also act more violent. And at the end of the day, if you have a more insecure society because of, as I also said, people coming in who have completely different culture and so on, it leads to more turmoil, of course. And I think that had an impact on the police and also the way they deal with a normal Swiss. Sometimes they treat you like a Nigerian drug dealer. So wow. that had an impact. And then, of course, in Corona time, I mean, in Germany, the police was driving after guys who were not wearing a muzzle, or they were hitting people, when they were not wearing a muzzle, for example. I mean, we never had that in Switzerland. I mean, maybe in one or two occasions, bigger demonstrations, but overall, also the way that the Swiss government treated the Swiss people during Corona has been different than in other countries. So they are still hesitant, to treat us the same way like the German police is treating the German citizen, or even the US is treating, their citizen. But in general, I mean, world is becoming more insecure. People look at the Yaos. I mean, the future, now they're here for 20 years that the world is going down and CO2 and all this bullshit. And at the same time, they also realize that the future is not that bright. They don't know, if they get the job or if they have a job. So this is all leading, to toxic environment. And I think that's basically all done because of government politics. They are fully responsible for, the situation we are in today.
The point you raised about immigration definitely caught me off guard, because it was always my understanding as well that Switzerland has historically had a pretty restrictive, say, like citizenship system, in addition to it's like immigration policies, where it is quite difficult to obtain citizenship. Has that changed, and is that a relatively recent development?
I mean, on the one hand side, of course, we had all these bilateral talks with the European Union. So allowing a lot of people from the European Union working in Switzerland, if they work for a few weeks, and they lose their job, then they're basically already qualified to get some social welfare from the government, like another Swiss who had worked, years ago. So, I mean, we had people from surrounding countries, but of course we also had a lot of guys, from Eritrea, from Africa, we had some refugees coming from the Middle East and so on. So I mean, when you look at, it's a political it has been a political mass migration crisis. It was a political agenda, to bring in as many foreigners as possible. And of course, I'm a libertarian, don't get me wrong. I mean, usually I'm for open borders, of course. Everyone should be able to go wherever he wants to. But as long as you have welfare states, then open borders doesn't make sense. And at the same time, migration should always be, individuals who are really pursuing, their happiness, individuals who want to leave, and then because they also believe in themselves, that they have a certain talent and so on. I mean, they should be able to migrate wherever they want to, of course, as long as they can self-sustainable. But of course, whenever a mass migration is becoming a political agenda, I mean, then this really should raise questions, and because it will never work, and it only leads to the toxification of the people. Because, you will always have people who basically in a welfare system, some have to pay and some are going to receive. And if you force migration on people against their will, and at the same time, they also have to pay for it, and at the same time, they have less money in their pocket because of inflation and the economical outlook and so on, it's just going to lead to tension. And I think this is something which we're going to see most likely very strongly this year. This year will be a period of divide and conquer, creating all different kind of political Muppet show groups which are going to fight each other. And this will be driven forward, with X and on the mainstream media. And so we have seen, there's a trend which has changed, We were not allowed to criticize. We have been censorized if we had different opinions than the official narrative. And now, of course, it's changing and opening up. But I truly believe, over the last 3-4 years, people also the cultural the debate are not so civilized any longer as it used to be 10 years ago. Now people are much more toxic. They rather prefer to scream. We also have developed, especially among the youngs, a culture that they don't even discuss because they don't have arguments. They just want to, they are completely brainwashed and they are de-illusioned. So they don't even want to talk to you about the current problems or hear a different opinion. So that's where we are. And this is a very tragic situation, of course.
I've heard from some people, especially on like alternative media channels, when they talk about Switzerland, especially when it comes to banking privacy and having some degree of financial independence, that Switzerland's reputation has taken somewhat of a hit recently. And they say that there's other options like available for banking privacy. How true is that in terms of how like the Swiss government has begun to comply with more quote unquote globalist institutions and other Western governments' banking standards?
I mean, the banks are the banks. I think it doesn't make a difference if the bank is in the US or in England or in Switzerland. They all have to report. It's a network. The banks became basically an aid for governments, in delivering information and reporting and all that kind of stuff. So I think even UBS and Credit Suisse, 20 years ago, they already received, UBS was acquiring Warburg. Credit Suisse took over First Boston, so they also received the primary dealer status from the Federal Reserve. So, we can also say that UBS and Credit Suisse, since the end of the 90s, are no longer Swiss banks. So, but I think, and I had, so I think, whenever, banks are the banks, and property rights within the banking system are only of temporary nature. It's not clearly defined. Whenever you hand over money, to the banks, then you just become kind of beneficial owner, but you're not the owner any longer. So it's going into the hands of the banks. And then we have this great taking story that, also shares and so on might disappear or have been leaned out several times. So I think, all the risks that I can see today are in the banking system. And if you believe you can hide or that you can protect your wealth in the banking system, I think then you are mistaken. So the best thing to do is, and I have a good customer of mine. He has purchased a substantial amount of physical gold, but he's basically an entrepreneur. He's, he's very wealthy, but he told me once, Claudio, I'm not very happy to purchase, this amount of gold. Basically, I put it in the ground, not doing anything. I'm an entrepreneur. I want that my money is working. I want to create goods and services for the rest of the people to make sure that they have a better life and so on. So the basic idea, just to use capital and put it somewhere and in the ground, dig it in the ground. That's not what I really want to do. But then he said, but Claudio, the most important aspect to me is that I have something outside the banking system. This is the reserve. This is the insurance that, once the system is going down the drain, that I at least have something which hopefully then will also be kept safe and will allow him and his family, to restart. And I think that's the right idea. That's how you have to look at physical gold and also at the banking system.
I see. Now, for my audience, that they're definitely partial in terms of finding alternative wealth building and wealth protection strategies. But some of these people, and I would say a substantial portion, are just beginners when it comes to getting into gold. How would you recommend that they start investing in gold and adding that gold into their portfolios?
Okay. So I think if they only have small money and they save some money, put it on the side. I think if you let's assume up to a value of 50,000 or 100,000, I would suggest, go to a local precious metal dealer, try to find, smaller denominations, coins, small bars, stuff like this. Try to build up a liquid stock. Always keep in mind that most likely in the future, you're going to use your ounce of gold to do a barter, a trade, whatever. But also keep in mind that 100 years ago, an ounce of gold purchased a house in Berlin. So gold is the money of the kings, silver is the money of the bourgeoisie, barter trade is the money of the farmer, of the peasants, and debt and paper is the money of the slaves. So, I think don't go for a kilo bar or 500 gram bar. I think, keep it, try to make sure that it's as small as possible so that you can use it in the future. And when it comes to silver, a few silver coins also always make sense, because silver coins really, you can use it then to go to the farmer and you can negotiate, how many chickens you will receive for an ounce of silver over a certain period of time. So I think, make sure that you have some cash, gold is money. So some in form of gold and silver coins nearby you. And if you have more than 50 or 100,000, then it would also make sense, to maybe think about a solution which would store it outside of the jurisdiction that you are in. The US had a gold confiscation in the past. In the Eurozone, Germany, Russia, they also had gold confiscation, for example, Italy. So, yeah. And I think I would not outlaw it, that this might not happen in the future again. So I will definitely then try, if you have a bigger amount, try to find a safe jurisdiction such as Switzerland. And then it can also make sense, because then it might be protected in the best possible way.
Fantastic stuff, Claudio. I found this information to be quite useful, and I believe my audience will find tremendous value in it. I think this is a good place to wrap this discussion up. But before we leave, feel free to promote your gold and precious metal advisory services.
Okay. Because you have a diverse audience, most likely, people can always send me an email if they have questions. They can also talk to me. I'm always happy, even if it's a smaller purchase, I can always help them to answer a few questions so that they don't make the mistakes I did when I started buying gold or silver, when it comes to the formats. And I think it's always important also is, that the people keep in mind that they should only use money they don't need in the next 2-3 years, and then to turn that into physical precious metal, because then I think you cannot do anything wrong. But I try to avoid, that people go into gold and believe in 2-3 weeks it's going up, or in 6 months time, and then they can sell with a huge, so that they don't put themselves under pressure. They also have to give their gold investment a certain time. so that they don't need it or want to liquidate in 6 or 8 or 10 months time. But so people can go on my homepage, claudiograss.ch. I mean, I'm also writing a blog with maybe 2 or 3 articles a month about geopolitics, philosophy, monetary methods, stuff like this. And they can always, shoot me an email if they have a question.
Great stuff, Claudio. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, and to my audience as well. Thank you for your attention. And with that, El Niño has spoken.